All right, welcome back to the deep dive. You're ready to jump into something pretty heavy today.
Absolutely. Always ready to go deep.
Awesome. So we're going to be talking about something that's been in the news a bit recently, actually, thanks to Justin Bieber being super open about his health.
Yeah, exactly. And it's Lyme disease.
Right, Lyme disease, and more specifically for you, our listeners, Lyme disease and, well, it's a tricky one, and how it kind of messes with your mental health.
It does. Yeah. It's way more complicated than people think.
So we've got a whole bunch of articles here, news pieces mostly, that talk about Bieber's experience, obviously, because that's what's kind of pushed this whole thing into the spotlight, but also like the bigger picture of Lyme disease, like what it means for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. For everyone listening. I mean, it's one of those things where you hear about it, but you don't really understand it until it hits close to home, right?
Right, exactly. So what we're going to try to do today for you guys listening is really kind of break down how difficult it can be to even diagnose Lyme disease.
Yeah.
We'll talk about like how the symptom, they can be so similar to other things like mental health conditions, stuff like that.
Right.
And then, why it's so important to understand this stuff if you're dealing with any kind of chronic illness or just, trying to take care of yourself mentally and physically.
Absolutely. I mean, it's all connected, right? You can't really separate the mind from the body.
Right, for sure. So I guess like starting off, Bieber, right? Like him coming out and talking about this was kind of a big deal.
Huge. I mean, it really was. And it brought so much attention to this.
It did. Like just him, explaining that he has Lyme disease and that it's been affecting him, physically, mentally. Like it was huge for people who, maybe were going through the same thing but didn't really know what was going on. But yeah.
Like he was getting a lot of flack for how he was looking and behaving, and people were just, making assumptions.
Right.
And then he comes out and he's like, listen, I have Lyme disease. I've also had a really bad case of mono. And, mono can really knock you on your butt.
It does.
It messes with your energy, your brain function, everything. So, for him to come out and say, hey, this is what's going on, it really opened up this conversation.
It did. So, okay, so Lyme disease, like, let's get into the nitty-gritty for you listening. Like, how do you even know if you have this thing? It sounds like getting a diagnosis is like half the battle.
Yeah, it really is. It's super tricky. And one of the main reasons is because the symptoms they're so all over the place. Like you can't just say, oh, if you have this, then you have Lyme disease, because it's not that simple. It can be fever, it can be a rash, joint pain, fatigue, neurological problems. Like it's a laundry list, and it's not specific at all. And that's where it gets really tricky, especially when you start looking at things like, fatigue. Fatigue is such a common symptom for so many things.
It is.
Depression, anxiety, brain fog. And all those things, they can also be symptoms of Lyme disease, but they're also symptoms of primary mental health disorders.
Right. So how do you even how do you tease that apart? Right.
Right. And that's the $1 million question. Like how do you differentiate between, is this Lyme disease or is it something else?
And the sources actually, they quote this doctor, Dr. John Aucott. He's from Johns Hopkins Lyme Disease Research Center. And he says, our recent symptom survey could not distinguish Lyme and depression. And it's especially hard when you're talking about these, what he calls vegetative symptoms, things like fatigue, sleep problems, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And it makes sense, right? Because if you're constantly tired, you're not sleeping well, you're just going to be, you're going to feel down. You're going to feel anxious. You're not going to be able to function at your best.
Right. And you might not even think about Lyme disease.
Right. Exactly. And then there's the whole thing with the rash.
Right. The bullseye rash. Right. Everyone's heard of that.
Yeah. The classic bullseye rash. But here's the thing. Not everybody gets it.
Really?
Yeah. So you can't rely on that as a surefire sign. And then you have people who don't even remember getting bitten by a tick.
Oh, right. I mean, they're pretty small, those things.
Tiny
Yeah.
little things. So you could easily get bitten and not even realize it.
Right. And then there's the tests too, right? Like even if you go to the doctor and you're like, hey, I think I might have Lyme disease, like the tests aren't always, 100%.
Yeah, that's another layer of complexity here. The antibody tests, which are the ones that are most commonly used to diagnose Lyme, they might not even pick it up in the first month of infection.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Because it takes a while for your body to actually start producing those antibodies that the test is looking for.
So it's like you could have it, but the test doesn't show it yet.
Exactly. And then you also have studies showing that, well, the tests aren't always accurate. They can give false results sometimes.
So it's like even if you're trying to be proactive, it's not a guarantee.
Yeah, it's a really tricky situation. And so you can kind of see how, somebody could go to the doctor, they're feeling fatigued, they're feeling down, maybe they've got some other kind of vague symptoms, and the doctor might be like, well, this sounds like depression, this sounds like anxiety,
Right.
and they might start treating for that, not realizing that there's actually this underlying Lyme infection that's causing all these problems.
Oh, wow. And that's obviously not ideal.
Not ideal at all. It could delay the proper treatment, and, Lyme disease, if it's not treated, it can lead to some serious complications.
Right. So, okay, so let's say, you do get diagnosed, you go through the treatment for the initial infection. Like, are you good to go then? Or is there more to this?
Well, that's the thing about Lyme disease. It's not always a quick fix.
Yeah.
Even after the initial infection is treated, some people can have symptoms that linger for weeks, months even.
Really?
Yeah, and this is what we were talking about before. Those lingering symptoms, they can be things like fatigue, night sweats, stiff neck, headaches. The sleep problems can continue. And, depression is often a big part of this picture as well.
Oh, wow. So it's not just like, okay, you take some antibiotics and you're good to go.
Not necessarily. It's more complicated than that.
So there's actually a name for this, right? It's called PTLDS.
Yeah, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome.
PTLDS. Okay.
And it's not everybody, but it's a significant percentage of people.
Yeah.
The sources we're looking at, they say it's somewhere between 10 and 20% of people who have Lyme disease end up with PTLDS.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah, it is. It's not a small number. And,
Sure.
for those people, it's a really difficult situation to be in because they've gone through the treatment, they've done everything they're supposed to do, and they're still not feeling well.
And this depression thing, right? Like it seems like a pretty big deal with Lyme disease. Like it's not just a coincidence that people are feeling down, right?
No, not at all. I mean, depression it's a real issue for Lyme patients. And it can happen, at any stage, really. It can happen before treatment, during treatment, even after treatment.
Really?
Yeah, it's very common. In fact, the sources say that between 8 and 45% of people with PTLDS have depression.
Yeah.
It's a pretty significant range, but it just shows you how prevalent it is.
Yeah, that is a huge range. But even at the low end, that's a lot of people.
It is. And and Dr. Alcott, he makes this interesting point about it too, is he says that the depression in PTLDS tends to be, mild to moderate most of the time, but can become major depression.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and obviously that's a big concern. I mean, major depression can lead to, suicidal thoughts, and that's something we always have to be, super vigilant about.
Right, for sure. So it's like this double whammy, right? You're dealing with the physical symptom of Lyme disease, and then you've got this mental health component on top of it.
Exactly. And it's really hard to tease apart, like we were saying before, because the symptoms of Lyme can mimic depression.
Right.
So, how do you, as a doctor, is this depression just a result of the Lyme disease, or is this a separate issue that needs to be treated differently?
Right.
And it's not always clear, but there are some clues. There was some interesting research that found that people with PTLDS tend to have more trouble with memory-related tasks compared to people with major depression.
Okay, so that's something that doctors can look for.
Yeah, it's a subtle difference, but it could be a helpful clue in figuring out what's going on.
Okay. So we've talked about the symptoms, right? We've talked about how hard it can be to diagnose Lyme disease,
Yeah.
how the symptoms can overlap with mental health stuff. Like what's actually happening in the body? Like biologically, what's going on that's causing all this?
Right. Well, one of the key things that researchers are looking at is inflammation.
Inflammation. Okay.
Yeah. So, inflammation, it's basically your body's natural response to injury or infection.
Right.
But when it becomes chronic, when it's, ongoing, it can actually start to damage your tissues and your organs.
Hmm.
And the thing with Lyme disease is it triggers this inflammatory response.
Okay.
And Dr. Alcott, he actually talks about this. He says that when it comes to the depression that's associated with Lyme, he thinks it's probably a combination of things.
Okay.
Part of it might just be the stress of dealing with a chronic illness, like we were talking about before.
Right.
But he also thinks that there's probably a more direct effect on the brain itself.
Okay, so the Lyme disease is actually affecting the brain.
Yeah, and inflammation seems to be a big part of that.
Okay.
There have been some really interesting studies using PET scans, which is a type of brain imaging.
Okay.
And what they found was that people with PTLDS, they have higher levels of this protein called translocator protein, TSPO, in their brains compared to people who don't have Lyme disease.
Okay, and what does that protein do?
Well, it's a marker for inflammation in the brain. So basically it's showing that there's more inflammation going on in the brains of people with PTLDS.
Oh, wow. So it's not just the body reacting to the illness, it's like the actual bacteria that causes Lyme disease. It's somehow messing with the brain.
Yeah, that's what the research is suggesting. And this kind of makes sense when you look at the bigger picture, because we know that inflammation in general is linked to depression.
Oh, right.
So, it's not just specific to Lyme disease. There's a broader connection there.
Okay. That's really interesting. So we've got this kind of like perfect storm situation, right? Like hard to diagnose, symptoms that overlap with other stuff, this whole inflammation thing happening in the brain. Like what what does this mean for people who are going through this? Like what's the impact on their lives?
I mean, it's huge. Imagine, you're feeling awful, you're exhausted all the time, you're having all these weird symptoms, and you don't know what's wrong with you.
Right.
You go to the doctor, and maybe they can't figure it out right away, or maybe they dismiss your concerns, and you're just left feeling like, like you're great, like it's all in your head.
Right. And that's going to be so frustrating.
It is. It's incredibly frustrating and isolating. And that's on top of the physical symptoms that you're already dealing with.
Right, right.
So there's this whole emotional toll that comes with it.
Yeah.
And one of the people that we read about, Allie Cashel, she's the president co-founder of Suffering the Silence, which is this online community for people with chronic illnesses. And she talks about this. She says when somebody is sick for a long period of time, their mental health is going to suffer.
Right. Makes sense.
And she also makes this really interesting point about how it goes both ways.
Oh, okay.
She says, if someone is mentally ill for a long period of time, their physical health is likely going to suffer as well.
Oh.
So it's this vicious cycle, right?
Right, for sure.
And it's something that we really need to pay attention to, because it's not just about treating the physical symptoms, it's about treating the whole person.
Right, right. It's like a mind-body connection.
Exactly. And one of the things that's really tough for people with Lyme disease is that, they often face this disbelief, this dismissal, not just from, their friends and family sometimes, but even from doctors.
Yeah. That's got to be hard.
It is. It's like, you're being told that it's all in your head when, you're really suffering.
And Allie, she actually talks about her own experience with this. She says that her depression, it stemmed from, experiencing such debilitating symptoms over such a long period of time and often facing a lot of dismissal over the course of their treatment and diagnosis journey.
Yeah, and that's so common for people with chronic illnesses. They're told that they're imagining things, that they're exaggerating, that it's stress, that it's, all in their head.
Right. And that just adds another layer of difficulty to the whole thing.
It does. It makes it so much harder to cope, to get the help that you need.
Right. Okay, so clearly there's like a huge need for more awareness, right? Like
Yeah.
doctors need to be more aware of Lyme disease and all its complexities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They need to be more aware of the symptoms, of the fact that, it can affect people in different ways. They can linger for a long time.
Yeah.
That there's this strong connection to mental health issues.
Right. And there are resources out there, right? Like for both patients and doctors, like to learn more about this stuff.
Yeah, definitely. There are some great organizations like the International Lyme and Associated Diseases Society, ILIDES, and the Bay Area Lyme Foundation.
Okay.
And they have a ton of information. They have resources for patients. They have resources for doctors. They're doing research. They're advocating for, for better treatments and better understanding of this disease.
Okay. So it's like if you're struggling with this, you're not alone and there are people who can help.
Exactly.
Mm.
And it's important to remember that even if the mental health problems are not directly caused by the Lyme, they still need to be addressed.
Right.
It's about treating the whole person, not just the disease.
Mhm. Right. And I like what Allie said about, people needing to kind of own their experience, like to acknowledge both the physical and the mental aspects of their illness.
Yeah, I thought that was a really powerful message. She says, in doing that and speaking about their illness more openly, it's my hope that people will be able to recover from that trauma a little bit easier.
Okay. So it's like it's not just about, getting the right treatment. It's about like processing the whole experience and kind of coming to terms with it.
Exactly. It's about healing on all levels.
Okay. So to kind of sum this up, we've learned a lot about Lyme disease today, right? Like it can be really tricky to diagnose. The symptoms can be all over the place. There's this overlap with mental health stuff.
Yeah, and it's not just in your head. There's a real biological basis for this connection between Lyme disease and mental health.
Mm.
This inflammation in the brain.
Right, right.
And the impact on people's lives it's huge. It can be really debilitating, both physically and mentally.
Right.
And I think the biggest takeaway for me is just the need for more awareness.
Yeah, for sure.
We need to be talking about this more. We need to be educating doctors. We need to be educating patients, and we need to be, supporting people who are going through this.
Absolutely. I mean, this whole thing, it just shows you how complex chronic illnesses can be.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, what other conditions might have similar connections that we're not even aware of yet.
Right. Like what other things are we may be missing because we're not looking at the whole picture.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, this has been a really, really interesting dive, I think, into a really complex topic.
I agree.
So for you listening, I guess the takeaway is, if you're struggling with anything, don't be afraid to advocate for yourself.
Absolutely.
Do your research, find good doctors, and most importantly, take care of yourself, both physically and mentally.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.